Hey everyone, and welcome to Seriously Risky Business. I'm Adam Boileau. I'm joined by my colleague Tom Uren, who writes our newsletter of the same name. This work is supported by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and is syndicated by Lawfare. This week's episode is also sponsored by the good folk at Airlock Digital, who make an application allow listing solution that's actually workable. Catalin Campanu had a chat with them in the week's sponsor interview, so check that out. Over the past couple of years on the main Risky Biz show, Pat and I have been getting our heads around the sheer scale of the Southeast Asian cyber scam. Like I was going to say business, but it's kind of not even that, right? It's there's forced labor and deep ties into government, and some of the numbers involved are just breathtaking. And you've written this week about a report from the UN into it. So what's the UN got to say about the state of the cybers in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, so the report looks at the adoption of technology by transnational crime organisations, and it's not intended to be focused on Southeast Asia. It's just
that's where
all the good examples happen to be. And what really struck me about this report is it really changed the way I thought about Telegram. And so in my head, Telegram, bad stuff occurred on Telegram, but it was kind of around the edges. And this report talks about massive transnational crime organizations that are based around Southeast Asia that are using Telegram at pretty much every level of their organization as an enabler. The report was authored by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime, and sort of broadly it looks at things like the increasing use of deepfakes, online gambling, money laundering, and all these come together in that region of the world, and they've ended up, reinforcing each other in a way. So the part of these businesses, which originally started off as just gambling businesses, and they were illegal gambling. During the pandemic, a lot of them shifted online, and they're just making huge amounts of money. That resulted in them figuring out how to do money laundering at a big scale, and then some of them migrated into synthetic drug production and trafficking, even more money. And with the rise of Telegram, there's also been a huge number of service providers that have joined, I guess it's like an illegal party, and now offer services. And so Telegram has been used by some of these crime organizations to offer marketplaces where they basically guarantee or vet vendors and provide guarantees and hold money in escrow. So they're kind of the market makers. And the markets include things like illegal gambling, money laundering, selling of malware, selling of stolen data, murder for hire, prostitution. It's involved in trafficking. So pretty much every criminal enterprise you can think of, it's in those markets. And those markets are structured and so that they're sort of broken out into different channels, and some of them are huge. So the biggest one right now, 850,000 people on it.
Dang, that's a lot of scale, and comparing that to the crime phone network, because we saw takedowns of a bunch of different crime phone networks over the last year or so, couple of years, and some of those were like tens of thousands of users, and we're talking like almost 1 million people in some of these channels. Like that's pretty startling.
Yeah. And so there's degrees, right? So some of those people are selling things like generative AI, and that may be face swap or voice swap. And so you can think of legitimate uses for that. It just happens that they tend to be used to circumvent know your customer, and so they perhaps might clone a voice so that you can pass a know your customer test or replace a face or something like that. They'll be used to generate phishing emails that are more convincing. So all of these things kind of reinforce, because the easy availability of being able to buy these services means that it's easier to get into the criminal business, I guess, for lack of a better word. And it's easier for money laundering because they involve lots of different people. The gambling itself is part of the money laundering business because you can shuffle through gambling businesses. And so because part of it is related to human trafficking, there's a huge amount of just misery and harm caused by both people who are getting scammed, because, pig butchering and romance scams and cryptocurrency scams are all part of this as well. So there's misery on all sides, like misery on the victims who are scammed and misery on the victims who are forced to work in compounds, basically. It's and the one of these businesses, because there's a lot of cryptocurrency involved, Chainalysis found that it had dealt with more than $49 billion in cryptocurrency. Like
that's ludicrous. Like that's GDP scale money, right? That's not crime syndicate money. That's country.
Yeah. And these syndicates own hotels, casinos. They're in property development, so they are real transnational crime organisations. They're not just sort of creatures of Telegram or creatures of the internet. They're big business.
Yeah, and I guess the fact that they are actually operating functional marketplaces on top of Telegram, I think is one of the interesting angles, right? Because trust amongst these people, trust in a criminal marketplace, is super important. And we saw with early darknet markets kind of how important it was that the market provided some of that trust that in a anonymous or decentralized kind of economy is quite difficult to build. Like you have to build like reputation and escrow services and all those things are just, they are key enablers. And the fact that Telegram is such an important part of that fabric. I mean, I was trying to think of is this like Amazon for crime, right? Where you've got a whole bunch of cloud services, like mirroring the way that we've started to build things out of components in a cloud software as a service kind of world, but it's kind of the same for crime services. But then there's also the kind of marketplace aspects of it that are kind of almost more important, because we've seen the Russian cybercrime world commoditize bits of crime.
Yeah.
But there's so much kind of cutthroat dog eat dog in those marketplaces, and they've been, collapsed and taken over, and there's all sorts of shenanigans. Whereas to get to a scale of tens of billions of dollars, like the market has to work pretty well, right?
Yeah. So I think Amazon for crime is really interesting way to think about it. That hadn't occurred to me as I was writing the piece. Now, the whole problem is very, very complex because part of it relates to undergoverned areas. There's just not a lot of policing in some of the areas that this has occurred in, including along the Mekong River, so the border areas. One of the examples the report talks about is a marketplace called Fully Light, which was run by a different crime group. It was actually one of the sort of offshoots of the Myanmar army. And they ran this Fully Light marketplace. It only had 350,000 people on it, but it was the original that this bigger marketplace was based on. So the structure and the way it runs is very similar. Now, that actually got taken down. So good news. The bad news is it took military action. So a rebel force actually took over militarily, like with warfare, took over Fully Light. And so that marketplace has sort of shriveled away, but there's been another that's appeared in its place. So given that Telegram just seems so central and that there's been at least some shift in Telegram, apparently, given the arrest of its CEO recently in France, it just seems like there's a huge opportunity here. Like, we're not going to solve this problem because there's so many factors going into it. There was COVID-19, it's poor governance, it's the rise of online crime, it's cryptocurrencies. But it seems like at least trying to get Telegram to do something is potentially one of the easier wins that'll not solve the problem. It'll just make it less bad.
Yeah, I mean, if I was a Southeast Asian organized crime syndicate and, I was going through my risk register, that dependency on Telegram would definitely be up there because it's outside of your immediate sphere of influence. Like if you're the government, but at that kind of scale, you become the government, you become the military of the regions. But Telegram is, overseas, it's, kind of outside of their immediate reach. And there's a relatively small amount of people, famously. That's a reasonable target for coercion or corruption or law enforcement action. So, it would be on my risk register, and it seems, the French action against Durov seems maybe a bit more sensible now. Or, sensible is not the right word. You can understand that this has a bunch of other aspects around the world beyond just the one that we've seen focused on in France, because Telegram is so important in all sorts of myriad ways. And that's the bit that your reporting kind of highlighted for me is, the extent of the reach of Telegram. And I think, that's a very good point to make. And I'm sure that, the listeners of the show and readers of your newsletter are probably, in a better than average position to think about that.
Well, what occurred to me is that if you're a cop on the beat, you're working on a crime, Telegram's involved, you put a legal request in, you probably don't get an answer. But it's only when you get a report like this that you sort of step back and see how it's intimately involved in the sort of very big picture. So that's the report, the Telegram runs as a thread throughout it, but it's not actually focused on Telegram per se. It's focused on all these other technologies as well, which are also in their own ways different problems. So I'm just pulling that out and stepping back and saying, this is actually something really important that we should be thinking about right now because of what's happened to Durov.
Yeah, it's an opportunity to, apply some pressure that might have an outsized influence, beyond just what we've seen so far.
Yeah, very much.
Another thing you wrote about this week was there's been a bunch of reports about a Chinese, I think MSS-linked hacking group that's been seen inside US telco networks, and in particular inside lawful intercept systems in US telco networks. And that seems pretty interesting. We've seen a lot of conversation around that. So what's going on in everybody's eye?
So the story that appeared in the Washington Post is that there's indications that the Chinese were interested in the lawful intercept systems. So there's no confirmation that these were breached or that they did anything with them as yet. The breach was actually reported by the Wall Street Journal a week or two ago. So that struck me as interesting. That makes total sense because if you're in a lawful intercept system, you can just abuse it. The theory reported in the Post is that the Chinese are after the target lists, and that the target lists would tell them who are the Chinese agents that are under investigation. And so that would be a counterintelligence operation.
Yes.
So, and so that seems like a very plausible theory. That would make sense. You can get all sorts of things from a telco network that are very, very interesting, but you can't get those. The only place those lists exist is in the lawful intercept equipment, I'm guessing. That would make sense, right?
Yeah, well, the system's kind of immediately plumbed into it. The systems that handle loading the warrants, getting the data out, etc.
Yeah, so what struck me about this is the sort of incident that's used by privacy and security advocates, I guess. And they'll say, you can never have a backdoor. I don't like the word backdoor because it's used pejoratively.
Yeah.
Because it'll always be abused by the bad guys. So we should never have one. Now, I think actually that logic is just flawed because, anything you do has benefits and costs. So it's the benefits and costs that you've got to weigh up. Now, it's clearly bad assuming that the Chinese did get into the system. If they did, that would be bad. But you've got to weigh up the benefits you get from it. So typically countries produce reports into how their interception schemes are going. You know, things like how many warrants were issued, how many people were arrested, how many were convicted. And invariably those reports have numbers of people who were arrested because of lawful intercept, and police invariably say it's a very, very valuable tool. So you've got to weigh up what's the benefit from domestic law enforcement versus, you know, what's the damage done, and then what else can you do to secure it? So I think it's not a binary argument as it's portrayed. So that's really my thinking about it. I cite in my article some of the numbers that in the US in the last year or so who were arrested and convicted because of that. And, you know, national security is a serious problem. But I think also crime is a serious problem.
Yeah,
and so we want to be able to, we need to have tools to tackle both. And the answer is not to throw away the tools. The answer is to make the tools more robust and spend more time and effort trying to secure them.
Yeah, I think 'cause Pat had Mike Burgess, who was head of ASIO, right, in Australia, had him on the show for an interview not so long ago, and he was talking about, you know, if you don't have avenues for lawful intercept, so this was in the context of end-to-end encrypted messaging, like if you don't have avenues there are other ways, right? You've got other options, but those options are expensive and difficult.
Yeah.
And if you have, as a government, you know, as a country, have decided that, you know, we should have lawful intercept, then, you know, doing it in a way that is the right trade-offs, right, the right set of costs and benefits makes a bunch of sense. And I mean, yes, there's, you know, the people who say, right, it's very hard and impossible to build a secure, you know, backdoor secure intercept mechanism. Like, they're not wrong. You know, I mean, in my professional career, I've broken into lawful intercept systems, and I'm pleased to say that, like, it wasn't easy.
Yep.
You know, when I had that as my tasking, go break into lawful intercept, see if it can be done. Like, it took me a while in some cases, and you know, my experience was the people running those systems and the telcos and whoever else, you know, did take that stuff real seriously. And, you know, if anything, you know, as someone who grew up with cypherpunk, who grew up valuing privacy and those things, like, I was kind of heartened by how seriously they took it. So, you know, when you see reports like this, like, of course it's possible. They're computers. You know, We've seen air gap jumping malware. We've seen all, you know, people breaking into, you know, the uranium enrichment centrifuges in Natanz, right? There's a way, no matter how hard you do it. But yeah, the nuance of those trade-offs, I do think, gets a little bit lost sometimes, you know, in the commentary.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of argument would be, okay, Iran should never build nuclear reactors because the centrifuges were vulnerable to malware. Well, of course, Iran's going to keep doing that, even if it is vulnerable.
Yeah.
Anyway,
exactly. Actually, staying with the axis of evil. We had some, like, I want to say it was the comedy section this week of your newsletter. We had some news around kind of the scale of North Korea's infiltration, I guess, of the cryptocurrency world by getting people hired. So what was amusing this week?
Yeah, so this is, I reported on an article in CoinDesk where they investigated how many people had been hired in the crypto industry. And it's just, I wanted to talk about it because it's just a really great article. It was very entertaining. It was written by Sam Kessel at CoinDesk. And part of the methodology they used is that they just looked at payments on the blockchain. And so some of the employees of cryptocurrency firms get paid in crypto. And then they followed the thread. And some of those payments would end up at North Korean sanctioned entities. And so they go, okay, that's probably a clue that these people were North Koreans. And Sam found a number of people who went on the record and said, oh yeah, we hired North Koreans. And he just puts the story together in an extremely entertaining way. So sometimes the employees just seem to do work and just work, IT, earning money, gets funneled to the regime. Sometimes, and there were several cases where there were subsequently cryptocurrency was stolen from these projects. So there's not necessarily a solid chain of evidence linking the North Korean employees to the subsequent theft, but you'd have to think strong possibility.
Yeah.
So one firm found that more than a third of its entire team was North Korean. so they hire one, and then because it seems like because that first one got through, they go, here's an opportunity. We'll just swamp them with more employees. And so they ended up hiring 5 of them.
And I guess some places have employee referral bonuses, like where you can recommend your friend, and if they get hired, you get a bonus. So it makes sense that you would, why stop with one North Korean contractor when you can have many?
Yeah, that's right. And then one part I really like is that one founder told CoinDesk that there was some clear red flags. And the quote is, every 2 weeks they changed their payment address, and every month or so they would change their Discord name or Telegram name. I just thought that was... okay, yeah, in retrospect.
I guess... if you're HR, or whatever they call it, people in culture these days in an organization, and nerds are kind of weird to start with, so you must be kind of used to weird stuff. So maybe North Koreans don't seem so out of place compared to the average, person who works in the crypto industry. So maybe it's a great cover. Maybe that's why they target cryptocurrency, because they can hide nerds there. So.
There was a phase in the newsletter where I would report every week or so on some massive cryptocurrency theft. And after reading this article, it kind of all makes sense in terms of the culture of some of these firms.
Yeah, exactly. Oh dear. Well, at least cryptocurrency is going to fade out of existence and be taken over by AI hype instead. So the small mercies, I suppose. I guess. Oh dear. Anyway, that's probably about all we have time for this week, Tom. If people would like to read Tom's fine work, head on over to news.risky.biz, where you can sign up to receive his letter, and also Catalan's regular Risky Biz News, also a great read. Thanks very much for your time, Tom. I imagine Pat's going to be back next week to grill you on your work. So I will sign off, and you can talk to Pat then.
Thanks a lot, Adam.